Welcome to Nancy's Classic Bedtime Stories. Tonight's classic read from Let Us Talk of Many Things by William F. Buckley, Jr., The Collected Speeches, Should Liberalism Be Repudiated? The opening statement in a debate with James Weschler at a National Review Forum, Hunter College, New York, April 9th, 1959. A half dozen times a year, National Review sponsored public meetings at Hunter College, lively affairs. This one was a debate with James Weschler on the proposition, resolved, that liberalism should be repudiated. The opening statement adduced central affirmations of the contemporary liberalism, which I thought at best vulnerable, at worst wrong and even dangerous. Many allusions were of topical interest to a highly partisan and expressive audience, especially the ones to a confidence man named Paul Hughes, who, it was revealed, had for months posed successfully as an employee of Senator McCarthy, collecting and relaying to his sponsors at the Washington Post and the Americans for Democratic Action the fruit of his supposed discoveries in McCarthy's offices. He had confided to his patrons that the cooking editor of the New York Post was a clandestine McCarthyite. I wish to distinguish sharply between the question, should liberalism be repudiated, and the question, will liberalism be repudiated? The differences are obvious, just as a century and more ago it was generally conceded that there was a significant difference between the question, should slavery be abolished, and the question, will slavery be abolished? Abolitionists had been active for many years, making effectively the case for the abolition of slavery, before it came to be said that slavery had been abolished. I say it came to be said that slavery had been abolished because, lo and behold, there are more slaves in the world today than there were 100 years ago, though indeed slavery has taken a different form from that familiar to the antebellum South. As to slavery of the earlier kind, I think it's safe to assume that against it, my distinguished adversary, Mr. James Weschler, would have joined forces with the abolitionists, as I hope I should have done. But in the current phrase of the eternal struggle against slavery, I fear we shall continue to limp along without Mr. Weschler's support. I cannot think of a single word James Weschler, a spokesman for American liberalism and a product of it, has ever uttered, or a deed he has done, that could be proven to have given comfort to slaves behind the Iron Curtain, whose future as slaves would be as certain in a world governed by James Weschler as the future of slaves in Atlanta would have been in an America governed by Jefferson Davis. Not only do the voices of liberalism strike despair in the hearts of millions of slaves, they do more. They chill the hearts of potential slaves in the free world. Every time I go through an issue of the New York Post, I make it a habit to calculate roughly how much freedom I would lose if all the measures advocated in that issue were to become law. On a typical day, I count myself lucky to lose a mere 10%. When Mr. Weschler is feeling extremely liberal, I can count up to 25 or 30%. And of course, there are the days, for example, when Mr. Weschler calls upon us to surrender Quemoy and Matsu, in which he disposes of 100% of some people's freedom. As I say, there is no strain of the abolitionist remaining in the modern liberal, the mantle having fallen completely on the shoulders of conservatives. That development was spotted early by the philosopher George Santayana, who commented that the only thing the modern liberal is interested in liberating is man from his marriage contract. So I cannot predict when liberalism will be repudiated, but I can maintain that liberalism should indeed be repudiated and pray that the moment will not forever be postponed. Mr. Weschler, who is a superb journalist, is fond of focusing on little incidents of a workaday sort and placing them in proper focus in order to expose the black reaction of those who drag behind his own liberalism the black reaction of, say, the New York Times. It is a perfectly legitimate device, for we do indeed have the best view of the universe from the study of a grain of sand, though of course it makes a considerable difference what prism you use. For example, for years, Mr. Weschler and his associates have made great sport of the proposition that if a man is a loyalty risk, that is to say, if there are grounds for questioning his loyalty to the government of the United States, he should not be employed by the government of the United States, even in a non-sensitive position. I doubt if a week had gone by in a history of the Post under its present steward that Mr. Herblock, or Mr. William Shannon, or Miss Doris Fleeson, or someone else, has not regaled us with the story of the persecution of some poor communist working innocently in the post office, or the Bureau of Wildlife and Fisheries who has been wrested from his job by the violent hand of hysterical American conformism. Mr. Joseph L. Raw, Jr., co-founder with Mr. Weschler of the Americans for Democratic Action, led the fight in Washington against the dismissal of employees working in non-sensitive positions in government, and most recently won a notable victory in the case of Cole versus Young, in which the Supreme Court was persuaded that the relevant loyalty and security legislation really intended to reflect the views of Mr. Raw and Mr. Weschler rather than those of Senator McCarran, who is principally responsible for drafting the bills. As I read the glowing tribute to Mr. Raw in the New York Post, I was persuaded to take another view of that grain of sand. 3 years ago, a confidence man, Mr. Paul Hughes, was brought to trial in New York. He had successfully conned the editor of the Democratic Digest, the editors of the Washington Post, and Mr. Joseph L. Raw, Jr., extracting from them $12,000 in return for lascivious accounts of the venalities of Senator Joseph McCarthy, on whose staff he pretended to be serving as a secret investigator. The unfortunate Mr. Hughes then turned and tried to con the Federal Bureau of Investigation, an encounter which led to his present embarrassment. In the course of his trial, Mr. Hughes described his relationship with Mr. Raw, to whom he had sold his fabricated secrets. Mr. Raw is now on the stand and has been reminded that one of the secrets Hughes stole from Senator McCarthy was that McCarthy had a sympathizer on the staff of the New York Post. Mr. Hughes had found out, he said, a complete fabrication, I remind you, that McCarthy's spy on the Post was the cooking editor. Did you call Mr. Weschler, asked Hughes' lawyer, and tell him? Ross, yes, sir. Question. You didn't feel that the cooking editor was going to slant any recipes in MacArthur's favor, did you? Answer. That wasn't the purpose. The purpose would have been to have somebody there. Question. What was the purpose of McCarthy having a spy as the cooking editor? Answer. Because a cooking editor, like anybody else, has access to all the records, files, and clips and other matters on the paper, and to all discussion. It doesn't matter who the person is. I didn't feel McCarthy should have anybody on the paper. I give Mr. Weschler back his grain of sand, having now understood that it is all right for agents of the Soviet Union to occupy non-sensitive jobs in the United States government, not all right for a sympathizer of Senator McCarthy to stay on as cooking editor of the New York Post. This considerable facility of which I speak, to view a grain of sand in different ways, depending on the light, is indispensable to the successful operation of liberalism. It is the reason why, for instance, liberals can call for massive expenditures and reduce taxes, for equal treatment for all persons except wealthier persons, for an impartial receptivity to all points of view except the conservative point of view, for rule of law except when the Supreme Court decides to go in for a little sociological pioneering. The economic philosophy of liberalism is, every bit of it, reflected in a grain of sand, one of those that escaped Mr. Weschler's attention. In the tense closing hours of the 1958 gubernatorial campaign in New York, Averell Harriman, grown desperate, loosed on his opponent the three most sinister imaginable political imputations. The first had to do with Nelson Rockefeller's alleged inconsistency to Israel, but this quickly backfired when friends of Rockefeller were able to show that he had given barrels of money to the United Jewish Appeal dating back even to before Israel existed. The second two charges evidently worried Rockefeller so much that he spent virtually all his talking moments, right through to Election Day, denying he had ever entertained such heinous thoughts. Under no circumstances would he permit a rent rise in rent-controlled New York City, or stand by while the subway raised its fares. It is tempting to dig out the root economic assumptions of liberalism by examining its attitude toward the New York City subways. In a discussion of subways, moreover, one does not bog down with that old devil prophet, for the subways belong to the people of the city of New York. The calumny of Mr. Harriman attempted to pin on Mr. Rockefeller was that he would permit the transit authority to do the only thing the transit authority is permitted by law to do when it is losing money, namely, raise the fares. But raising subway fares is a politically explosive business, which is why Mr. Rockefeller went to such pains to express himself as horrified at the very thought. What must be done, both he and Mr. Harriman agreed, is to meet the subway deficit out of general funds. This involves, of course, a net imposition on non-subway riders for the benefit of subway riders. So be it. If all goes according to plan, Cayuga County apple pickers will soon be making it possible for Manhattan elevator operators to ride to work for 15 cents, even though it costs the transit authority 20 cents to provide the service. In due course, the political representatives of Cayuga County will appeal for increased off-season benefits for apple pickers, whereupon it becomes necessary to increase the taxes of subway riders. Keep this up, and the skies are black with crisscrossing dollars. A dispassionate accountant viewing the purposeless pell-mell would surely wonder, what on earth is this all about? What is wrong with the economy of the crisscrossing dollar? Well, for one thing, there is the well-known fact that any time a Cayugan sends a dollar down to New York City, is going to stop at Albany for an expensive night out on the town. But aside from the leakage, what is wrong with the political economy of liberalism, in which dollars are exchanged by political negotiation? What is principally wrong is that it is an economic of illusion. What is secondarily wrong is that the system permits profiteering by politically mobilized groups. The third way in which it is wrong is that it diminishes the influence of the individual in the marketplace, transferring the lost power to politicians and to the ideologues who stir them up. In the last days of 1958, Senator Jacob Javits wrote his constituents a glowing year-end report. From the middle of 1952 through 1958, he wrote, the federal government spent the enormous sum of $28 billion in New York State. The statistic was jubilantly reported, and the senator further uplifted his constituents by reminding them that the expenditure of federal funds in New York generated additional public and private spending, which might not otherwise have benefited New York. What was the senior senator from New York trying to tell his constituents, if not that New York, thanks to the acumen of New York's political representatives, was getting an outsized slice of the federal pie? But what did Senator Javits fail to report to his constituents? That during the period in question, the federal government received in taxes paid by New York citizens and corporations the sum of $83.6 billion, or about 3 times the sum of money that found its way back. The facts are these. Projecting the average figures over the past 7 years, New York State can expect to pay 18.5% of any future national tax levy, while the percentage of any federal aid program it is likely to receive 6.9%. In other words, New York senators and congressmen anxious to spend, say, $100 million of federal money on New York education will find themselves voting to tax New Yorkers about $250 million to make that possible. By contrast, Mississippi puts up 22% of the federal tax dollars and gets back $2.07. So that the Mississippi senator or congressman can assume that for every $1 million of extra taxes he loads down on his fellow Mississippians for federal aid projects, he can return them $10 million. In its exclusiveness, liberal economic theory lends itself to political deviousness. There is considerable sentiment in New York, for the most part stimulated by the indefatigable dissemination of liberal superstitions in favor of federal aid to education. Now I am convinced that there are residents of New York State who are concerned with the depressed level of education in Mississippi to the point of wanting to contribute New York dollars to the advancement of Mississippi education, and I am just as convinced that they do not number 0.1% of the population of the state. Indeed, not 0.1% of the readers of the New York Post. Federal aid programs are, for New Yorkers, a form of auto taxation in behalf of non-New Yorkers, but the voters do not know this, and Jacob Javits is not going to tell them, any more than Nelson Rockefeller did, or Averell Harriman, whose silence on the subject aroused the antagonism of neither James Weschler nor Dorothy Schiff. Forget everything I have said. Let us assume that schools rise up out of the cornfields, great big beautiful air-conditioned schools, staffed by teachers who have each spent 10 years at a teacher's college on a federal John Dewey fellowship and have passed examinations in all the works of Max Lerner, a prolific columnist for the New York Post. Education today claims to emphasize the development of the critical faculties, but to what purpose is not clear, and that is not clear is the central revelation of the contemporary critique of education. Although it is tacitly agreed that graduates of our schools must be molded in liberalism, to recall the injunction of Senator Joseph Clark in the Atlantic Monthly, it is not really clear what liberalism is. Mr. Weschler constantly bemoans in his paper the listlessness of the people and their failure to rally behind a more aggressive liberalism. And Professor Arthur Schlesinger, writing in The Reporter a year ago, spoke deeply and eloquently about our absent discontents. The readers of the New York Post have not felt deeply since the days of the Reign of Terror, back when Bertrand Russell, a fountain of wisdom out of which American liberals regularly drink, was telling Englishmen that Senator McCarthy had made the reading of Thomas Jefferson a criminal offense. Beyond the savage response of the liberals when their orthodoxy is threatened, a common psychological reaction, asked Mr. Max Lerner, liberals do not feel deeply because liberalism has no fixed acknowledged norms by which, taking the measure of our deviation, we feel deeply the need for reform. The big excitement at Yale University in the fall of 1958, in connection with the protest addressed to Khrushchev's against the handling of Boris Pasternak, was over the question whether Americans were morally licensed to issue such an objection. If the Soviet Union persecutes its intellectuals for writing the truth, the students assembled and concluded it is no different from a congressional committee's persecuting an intellectual for writing error. Truth, error, these are strange words, atavistic words. Granted, most students can be counted on to smell out the phoniness of the argument that America is as guilty as the Soviet Union in the matter of bringing intellectuals to heel. Left to their own devices, they would come to the acknowledgement of a qualitative difference between, say, Columbia's handling of Gene Weltfish and Russia's of Shostakovich. Still, they wonder, what is the theoretical base from which to talk back to the proposition that persecution is persecution and that that's all there is to it? Their grope because prevailing preoccupations are with method, not substance, and so by a little dialectic artfulness, one can group together the treatment of Pasternak and Lattimore under the classification, quote, the showing of displeasure by an agency of government towards an intellectual, unquote. If evil and good are merely conventional words, the student is left only with the fact of harassment to weigh, not the provocation of it. How can one feel passionately about method? And what other than method is one encouraged to feel passionately about? There was much more excitement over Senator McCarthy's methods, did he or did he not, in the case of Civil Servant Jones, approved methods of interrogation. Then over his putative revelations, did Civil Servant Jones in fact whisk away the atomic secret? There are many more allusions on college campuses to the fact that Salazar governs Portugal undemocratically than to the fact that he governs it well. Democracy has no eschatology, no vision, no point of arrival. Neither does academic freedom. Both are merely instruments, the one supposed to induce a harmonious society, the second supposed to advance knowledge. But let me say that I, for one, would not willingly die for democracy any more than I would willingly die for academic freedom. I do understand the disposition to die for the kind of society democracy sometimes ushers in, and I do understand the disposition to die in behalf of some of the truths academic freedom may have been instrumental in apprehending. There is the difference. It is not lost on the undergraduate that there is no liberal vision, and so long as there is not, there is no call for the kind of passionate commitment that stirs the political blood. What is the liberal millennium? As far as I can make out from reading the pages of the New York Post, it is the state in which a citizen divides his day equally among pulling levers in voting booths. Voting for what? It does not matter so much. It matters only that he votes. Writing dissenting letters to the newspaper. Dissenting from what? It does not matter, just so that he dissents. And eating. Eating what? It does not matter, even to the cooking editor of the Post, though one should, of course, wash the food down with fluoridated water. I advise my friend Mr. Weschler that he will have to make Max Lerner write columns twice as long if, in the years to come, he is to succeed in drugging his constituency with the superstitions of liberalism. He knows that. Every New Dealer knows that. Every socialist knows it. The dose must get stronger and stronger, or there is the danger that one will come out of it stupefied by one's long lapse into the state of intellectual and moral idiocy. When the day comes that the drug no longer works, we will properly celebrate the 20th century equivalent of the Emancipation Proclamation. That is the day when liberalism will be repudiated. That it should be repudiated has been evident to the editors of National Review from the moment our publication was launched. We stand ready to take over the Post and are prepared on this occasion to announce the identity of its next editor. You've guessed it, the cooking editor. And that's it for tonight. Hope you all enjoyed that. Good night.